and the information management brand inside of the big data portfolio. So the talk today is going to talk a little bit about kind of what the big data positioning on the IBM side looks like, our strategy, as Big Blue, and then I'll go fairly deep into Data Explorer, talking about kind of the value propositions and the capabilities. That'll transition into some of the customer success stories. I brought two, but we're small. If you want to ask questions, or I can talk about some other ones that might be closer to your industry, that's fine. And then I'll give just kind of a PowerPoint demo. I took some screenshots of the demo. Never know how much internet connectivity, or just kind of minimize the variables there. And then I'll hand it over to Vic to talk a little bit about how we're going to get started. So I looked at the list, the roster, looked like various backgrounds. Many of you might know this, but really what's happening out there in the digital world is an explosion of data, right? We're talking about things now just on the internet alone in exabytes, heading towards zettabytes, and really a desire to be able to understand what all that data really means. What are the insights? And Gartner kind of came out and classified some of the characteristics of that data. So high volume, there's a lot of it. It's moving, it's being created at a high velocity. It's very diverse in terms of variety. And 80% of it's unstructured, roughly 80% of it's unstructured. Folks are looking for the truth in there, right? That's kind of the big data message, is how do we leverage this high volume of data that's constantly being produced and really taking off as more devices and people are creating this data. IBM's big data strategy is to move the analytics closer to the data. IBM's analytics company, and kind of the old approach of moving the data into this or that engine or that repository is being replaced when you consider the big data challenge, right? It's so vast, it's constantly growing. So the trick is, how do we take those analytics and move them close to the data so we don't have to really move the data or copy the data around? And I think that's kind of the strategy here, and it really positions Data Explorer nicely, you'll see. From a kind of an architecture perspective, if you look at this chart, the IBM Big Data Platform, obviously there's Hadoop, right? It's a core pillar in any big data platform, kind of a batch processing at scale through MapReduce jobs. There's stream computing. IBM has our Streams product, which was commissioned by the U.S. government after 9/11, as the story goes, to be able to process data in motion and apply analytics, right? So think about calls happening or internet traffic. That's been productized now. It's a big part of the big data platform. Data warehouses. Where Data Explorer sits, just to orient you, is up in that visualization and discovery corner. Okay, so being able to kind of get some transparency or some visibility of all these moving parts and what's going on with the data, right? So just to kind of refine things even further, in order to really talk about big data, IBM, the Data Explorer team was part of this, and said, look, what are the places where this portfolio is resonating? And these are the 5 use cases where the big data portfolio is resonating. The 2 that I'm going to talk about, because they seem to be the 2 where the Data Explorer technology resonates, are the top 2. Big data exploration, which I realize is pretty broad, right? But it's really about understanding what you have access to, what you could leverage, discovery and navigation, and it's enterprise-grade capabilities when it comes to security and governance and so forth. And then the enhanced 360-degree view. Those are really the 2 that we've seen Data Explorer resonate. It's had a little bit of a role down in the others, security and intelligence extension. We do quite a bit of business in the U.S. government. I have a strong sense that we were probably involved, Data Explorer was probably involved in the whole PRISM scandal. I don't know that for sure, I'm not cleared, but the operations analysis piece, the data warehouse augmentation, but I'm really going to focus on the top 2 for today. So what is it? What's Data Explorer? Conceptually, Data Explorer is a technology to bring together data from disparate sources and correlate that information automatically to provide a single view of something. Could be an entity, could be a set of data that you want to look at. There's also some social capabilities in the product. So not only are you looking at all this data, but you can actually interact with it to some degree. Commenting, tagging, rating, the ability to organize the data in a virtual way through what we call shared folders, right? And this all kind of goes back into the index. After all, it's a search-based technology. So where we're consolidating the information is using an index. And those social capabilities basically apply to that index and can be used for better relevancy. It can be used for governance. Think of a knowledge worker flagging a piece of data that they think might be harmful in some way to kick off a background governance process, right? So that's what Data Explorer is. It's a unification layer, a virtual technique for getting access to data without having to move it or copy it. And it's a big part of the value proposition. So one way to kind of learn about it is to kind of look at the evolution of Data Explorer. It started about 15 years ago with a technology called clustering. And what clustering is, our definition at least, it's looking at unstructured data and deriving the themes from that data, what's in there, and then exposing those themes as navigation aids. So if you're looking at a whole bunch of data coming back from, say, a search query or a bunch of federated sources, right, what's in there? How do I get that kind of visibility, and then how do I use those clusters or themes to help navigate? So clustering was kind of where the technology got started. Very quickly we realized, hey, what if we were able to federate a lot of different sources? What if we could federate to Google or any of these kind of big web sources and see what's in there from a thematic perspective? And very quickly after that, we said, well, you know what? We could really optimize the relevancy here if we started to be able to search this. So the search technology came pretty quickly. And search in this context, I'm talking about the ability to crawl and index the data and maybe enrich it as it's being crawled and indexed and optimize the index for search and relevancy and interaction. And that kind of leads us to today, the big data era, where we're using the technology, which happens to be extremely scalable for reasons that kind of go back to the core foundation of the technology, to be able to crawl and index all kinds of sources. And this is not just content, but it's also metadata and security information. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a little bit of an innovation exercise. I'm going to take you a level deeper into the capabilities. Let's assume that we wanted to establish this kind of robust visibility and we didn't have anything today. I think in about 10 steps, I'm going to wager we can get there. And the first one's enabling a virtual data platform. So again, don't want to move data. It's too expensive to move it. It's really expensive to copy it because not only have you moved it, but you've made a copy that now has to be managed and synchronized and so forth. So we're doing it a virtual way to eliminate the costs of data migration and consolidation. Okay? The second thing I would do is I would physically distribute that for the benefits of availability, for failover, for resiliency, and for performance. Right? As you get more successful with the platform, you want to be able to scale it without losing performance for your end users and also for the devices that are refreshing the index. So I would distribute the platform. The platform should acknowledge the entities and relationships. It turns out when you're discovering and navigating through big data, the entities, like maybe a customer entity or a product entity or a claim in the insurance space or a drug in the pharma space, those entities can be extremely useful to latch onto, and then the relationships between a customer and a product or a customer and an account can be extremely useful for navigation. So reveal that domain model that kind of emerges from the data. I would acknowledge that. It should be able to automatically enrich the data. There are going to be things out there like glossaries, dictionaries, maybe even ontologies or taxonomies that if you can apply those to the data platform, you can make the data platform that much more valuable, basically adding structure to an unstructured group of data that you've collected. You have to enforce security. You have to be able to say that if you can't see this content in the underlying data repository, you're not going to be able to get to it at the virtual layer. So you have to be able to respect that security. Robust relevancy. I mean, at the end of the day, the reason you would use a platform like this for big data visibility is to get relevant information. So that relevancy should be out-of-the-box relevancy with the option to configure it to basically accommodate the domain or accommodate the user's particular role or leverage any other kind of data you might have. Maybe it's their geographic location, anything. I would simplify the administration for business users. These kinds of solutions, they don't just get installed and then remain valuable without some sort of care and feeding, the ability to attach new data sources, the ability to go in and create stop words, which are basically stop words are so common in the data that they really become meaningless from a relevancy standpoint. So the ability to go in and do that should be able to be done by business users. You shouldn't have to rely on developers or IT staff in order to configure the system. It should have an optional and approachable user interface. So the interface should be something that somebody can sit down from an end user standpoint and just use. And if that means it has to look like web search or social media, something that they're used to using outside of work, that's fine, right? And it should be optional. You might want to leverage a user interface, agent desktop, whatever it is that you already have in place without swapping out the interface, but still being able to leverage some of these capabilities, right? So optional and approachable. It should have some level of collaboration. I mean, almost every useful software product out there right now is at least thinking about attaching social capabilities, the ability to share information with colleagues, the ability to feed back into the system, right? So there should be some level of collaboration and also some tracking of platform usage. So the search logs and the reports, they should be able to be leveraged to make the system better over time. Basically create a learning system that can leverage its own use and track behavior. And I guess the last thing I would do is I would make sure to preserve the extensibility of the platform, because what you get off the shelf, at some point, it's not going to be enough for the users. So you're going to want to extend it to help in the call center. You're going to want to extend it to help a pharma researcher do their job. You're going to want to extend it to help with specific tasks for specific knowledge workers. So you want to work very hard to preserve that so that the system can be more useful to more people over time. And I would argue that's really kind of what the Data Explorer team did over the last 15 years when they set out to kind of build this product and respond to customer needs. This was really the journey that was taken, and it's resulted in a nice platform that obviously attracted IBM and a whole slew of customers. And I would say not really in any particular vertical or horizontal. If I were pressed, I would say the verticals that we see kind of the most customers responding to are the financial industry, the life sciences industry, including pharma. The government is quite interested in it. And well, insurance, I would consider that as part of financial. And then we also have a lot of OEM usage where the product's been kind of swapped into other software vendors' products. We're doing that internally inside of IBM. It's pretty interesting. It's now being included, Data Explorer, as part of the Big Insights, IBM's Hadoop platform. It's now the search within the Optum product, if you're familiar, the archiving product. It's being offered with Tivoli to make log analysis more user-friendly and more useful. And I've even seen heard some conversations about using it inside of Watson to kind of supplement some of the artificial intelligence. So it's been kind of an interesting ride for the last year and a half I know for the engineering team, and just to kind of hear about some of the stories. Anyway, back to these customers. These customers, some have been with us longer than others. One of the things they have in common is that, especially the ones that have been with the product for more than a year, they've started to develop these centers of excellence, because they start to recognize that with a single win in the call center or a single win in the R&D department, they start to gain capabilities, they start to see the usefulness and the value of the product, and they start to see other uses within the organization because it's such a flexible technology. And so in cases, customers having it for 5 years or so, they've spread out from marketing to sales to, executive dashboards that are configured for kind of that 30,000-foot view of the organization's performance. Call center reps I've mentioned, R&D, right? So these are the types of situations that I guess the converse that I haven't seen of this is where these particular departments all come and procure it. It doesn't really work that way. It's more of a platform type technology with end user applications that are configured to fit the task at hand. So let me go over some specific capabilities, just giving you a couple of screenshots for some of the more interesting interfaces that we've seen. The American College of Cardiology, right? They're responsible for helping cardiologists maintain their continuing medical education certificates. And they really wanted, when they came to us, they wanted to be a destination site. They were starting to see, cardiologists coming out, younger guys that were used to using Google, used to using web technology, that just weren't going and using the big, heavy, analog guidelines that the ACC puts out every year. So they came to us and said, how can we create a web presence? And long story short, we created a solution. You can go there, on your own to the acc.org site and kind of play around with it a little bit. But a couple of things that they did, a couple of capabilities that I want to highlight. The suggestions as you type, right? So that's the ability to kind of expose as I'm typing letters, and we've all seen this on web searches. I think the difference here is what Data Explorer is putting out there as suggestions. It's basically saying, here's what's in there. So we've noticed you've started typing these letters. Here's what's in the index that you might want to search for. So it can become a nice accelerator for answering questions and helping the users, the cardiologists. You can also see the clusters that I talked about over on the left and the ability to federate out to external sources. That's what I mean when we say federation. So there might be sources on the internet or even internally that for some reason you don't want to crawl an index. You can federate to those at query time and pull back information in almost near real time and then merge it in with the rest of the information coming back. Roscha is another customer that used this federation approach. They were pulling information from another research site to put in front of their researchers, right? And they're kind of mixing it with some of the other information that's coming back. Here you can kind of see, if you squint your eyes a little bit, so these users are logged in and they're using those social capabilities. So they're adding comments and ratings and kind of having a dialogue on top of the Data Explorer virtual data layer, right, through the search experience. And that information, when they add those comments, they go back into the index so that the next time somebody does a search, it can affect relevancy, right? So in some ways, it's a self-governing solution when end users get engaged with the content and start feeding back into the system. Here's another one. This is an analyst firm. It's not Forrester. It's an analyst firm that actually bought Data Explorer, and their analysts use it to do a couple things. They use it to monitor what customers are coming to their site and searching for. That's really useful to gauge demand. What are customers looking for that we could potentially sell them if we either have an expertise or start developing an expertise, right? So if you think about what analysts do. There's also quite a bit of relevancy tuning for the analysts based on what they do. So an analyst in enterprise software space for data warehouses might have a different relevancy tuning in Data Explorer based on their role than an analyst in the consumer space, for example, right? And so that's a really useful thing. They reported back, we have 3 times more findability, 3 times more productivity inside the organization in terms of reusing content and writing papers and getting ready for presentations, which is really what these analysts do. It's kind of their business model. This is one I was personally involved with a couple of years ago. I run these client value engagements, which Vic's going to talk about at IBM. They're really a really great way to get started. We go in and we talk for a couple days, and then we have about 3 weeks where we come back with a roadmap and a value proposition. And this applied physics laboratory down at Johns Hopkins University, their biggest need, if you think about what they do, they're a government think tank. They have assets and capabilities, pretty special assets and capabilities, abilities to launch satellites and do things that they get government funding for. And their biggest need was, well, how do we locate experts? We're constantly planning new projects, and we want to leverage if we're doing a satellite project, we want to know who are the guys and gals out there in the organization that have kind of done things like this before. So in order to kind of unlock these, and they're highly secure, by the way, right? They kind of have this interesting environment where they want to be collaborative, but they can't be too collaborative because, everything's kind of locked down based on clearance. So we really had to navigate an interesting environment with the Applied Physics Lab. But here's what that particular solution ended up looking like after we went through the client value engagement and figured out what we wanted to do with what data. We took their SharePoint profiles. They were a SharePoint group, and Data Explorer and SharePoint coexist very well. They took their internal collaboration tool that they had built for themselves, I think based on their security requirements. There was some information on the internet that people kind of opted into, LinkedIn type profiles, and a resume database, basically a bunch of resumes on a file system. Crawled and indexed that information and came up with a nice expertise finder. So you can type in this case, they typed in Java programming, and it comes back with a list of likely Java experts based on that information, whether it's in their resume or whether it's something that those users have been talking about in the collaboration space. You can also use it for just locating an individual. So if you happen to know a little bit about somebody, you can go and find that person and see kind of their virtual profile, right? So another benefit of virtual approach to data access is you can mix and match content from different sources without really having to highlight where it's coming from. And we certainly track it, but this snippet that you're looking at here for this particular individual, that information is coming from 3 or 4 different places, like I mentioned, right? And it's being put together in a rational way to basically present itself according to the requirements of the expertise locator that we worked on during the client value engagement. So a pretty interesting set of capabilities. This is the application architecture. I saw there were some technical sounding titles on the, so I'm not ashamed to go into this a little bit. Stop me if I go too deep. At the bottom of the architecture is the connector framework. This is how we integrate 90% of the time with the repositories. Got kind of a nice agnostic set of connectors that come with the product out of the box. There's also a connector software development kit. One thing that's nice about the IBM acquisition is IBM continues to encourage the engineering team to build out connectors for non-IBM products, SAP, Salesforce, various ERP systems, product lifecycle management. So it's a nice place to be. A lot of our competitors I've seen have been taken over by other companies the size of IBM, and they've been told to concentrate just on that company's repositories. An example is Microsoft bought one of our competitors, and they basically cut off the connector layer and focused it on SharePoint only. Right? That's not something I've seen IBM doing. I've seen the inverse of that, and I think it's a healthy sign for the product. The next layer, this is really the magic layer. This is where all the interesting semantic analysis and borderline artificial intelligence happens. So this is where, in the index, once the content coming up from the integration or connector layer is in the index, kind of its normalized form, you can do things that we call text or content analytics. So you can apply the thesauri, telling it, hey, IBM and International Business Machines, it's the same. Somebody searches for IBM, pull back information for the full name as well. So you can import those kinds of thesauri. This is where the clustering happens in terms of kind of figuring out what the themes are. The ontology support, we've got first-class support for ontologies, which are basically domain models that are very thorough in terms of capturing a specific domain. And if those can be injected and applied to the content you're indexing, it adds a lot of navigability benefits to the content. The entity extraction, it's very important to be able to figure out, this is product information, this is customer information. Remember I talked, that's such a valuable piece of discovery and navigation, being able to know what the entities are. It could be anything. There's an interesting case over in Europe where they've pulled out car information. It's a car manufacturer, and they're trying to build interfaces around their product, right? Car information. And then metadata extraction, the ability to kind of pull out any kind of metadata and expose it for navigation. So a simple example here might just be author. You want to filter down your results by who wrote the content, or when it was written, or where did it come from, which source or which folder or which file, right? So being able to take that metadata and create navigation aids. On top of here, very practical layer, this is where we tie into the authentication systems. This is where the security enforcement occurs. This is also where we tie into user profiles. So by knowing who the user is, if you go back to the analyst example, knowing sort of what they do within the organization, you can configure the interface and the relevancy really to match their job description. This is also where we do the federated query routing, which is the process I talked about of at query time going out to an external or some sort of federated source and delegating a search and then pulling those results back and interleaving them with what's coming back from the index. And all of that supports this application layer. And the application layer, like I said, the product ships with its own user interface, but you can also use your own application. So if you're a big SharePoint shop, or you use maybe WebSphere Portal, or you have your own proprietary desktop for your users, you can still expose the power of Data Explorer at the application layer. So I guess kind of to sum it all up, if you take anything away from the talk, these are some differentiators. These are the key qualities to the product. It's very scalable. I think it's part of the reason IBM invested in the company that created the technology. We started to see in the big data era that a lot of our old competitors from the enterprise search space, they couldn't play in the big data realm. Their technology that wasn't scalable enough. And the reasons why that is that go back again to the core of the technology. But it's good news for Data Explorer, and it's good news for IBM, the ability to scale horizontally and vertically. And that's really been, for the last year or so, a big focus in engineering to make sure that that sticks around as we start to integrate with some of the other big data products that are out there, including Hadoop. Accuracy provides high level of accuracy. I can provide a white paper on why that is. It comes back to the positional-based index of the technology, which is a real differentiator. Most other search platforms use what's called a vector-based index, which is basically reliant on term frequency. So the amount of times a term occurs in a given document is the main determinant of relevancy. Whereas with Data Explorer, the positional-based index is more around the occurrence of words next to each other, right? I tend to use the hot dog example where a hot dog, those words are next to each other, you're referring to a food. But if you say it's a hot day and I took my dog for a walk, sure, those words are there, but it's a totally different meaning, right? And in a term frequency that subtlety wouldn't exist. We talked about the integration layer and then security. Those are really the four areas where Data Explorer is really strong and IBM continues to focus. So let me tell you two quick stories of customers that took this platform and have been very successful with it over the last, I'd say, 5 to 7 years. And then I'll turn it over to Vic to talk more about the client value engagement. The first one's a big airplane manufacturer, and it's not Boeing. And this airplane manufacturer, we met them, I think this was about 7 years ago, and they were able to use the product in the first year to save $36 million. Right? Well, how did they do it? Well, they looked at it and said, we've got this business process of getting our planes back in the air that's really costing us a lot of money because we've got this broken business process, and for every minute that these planes are on the ground past the service level agreement, we have to pay the airlines, thousands of dollars. So they were paying out of pocket, every day for planes that weren't being fixed very quickly. And they knew the business process was broken. It was like a 7-step business process. At one point, they were printing out repair manuals. Somebody was taking them. They were taking them to someone who would then scan them in and run them through OCR. I mean, completely broken business process. They knew it was broken. They just didn't have the technology or the vision to really fix it. And when they saw Data Explorer, they said, this might be it. And they looked into it. And by bringing together all the information into a kind of a single virtual view, this is repair manuals, it's parts information, parts availability information, expertise information. They were able to skinny things down to kind of a 3-step process. The last time I talked to our contact there, they were even looking into a heads-up display to get this information right to the people that are kind of crawling around in the fuselage trying to actually diagnose the problem and maybe fix it right there. So some very innovative use of Data Explorer. And this organization is a good example of one. They were successful there. They saw the ROI in the first year with the $36 million. Oh, I forgot to mention, they saved $1 million additional dollars in paper and toner cost savings from that broken business process. So they took it and they've now got it deployed globally. They've got a lot of different organizations around the world that build different parts of the plane that do different things. They've got their suppliers using it in a supplier portal. They've got it in their contact center, which is really where this started. They've got it in their sales group, using it to communicate better with their customers. They've got it up I think, in about a dozen different areas within the organization. So real center of competency, center of excellence here around Data Explorer. Another one, different space. This is in the financial space. This is a large financial services firm. I'll give you a hint. They run retirement funds. They actually run IBM's retirement fund. So some of us in the room might be customers of this particular customer. And they saw Data Explorer as a way to kind of undo something that they had started 20 years ago. They had been doing, they knew they had to get information into a single screen for the people in their call center to interact with customers, for the people in their sales department and their marketing department to interact and prospect. And where they started about 20 years ago was doing application integration. So extremely expensive custom software development to actually kind of pull applications into a single screen and get close to that, single view. And when they saw Data Explorer, they said, this is a better way. This is a way to do it at the content level. Crawl and index the content in those applications and bring that together in an interface that can automatically detect and correlate information around customers, around financial funds, right, financial concepts. So they used it to kind of save a bunch of money initially, but then they took it and they used it for governance. They said, all right, if we can enable our people out there that are interacting with the data to flag data and comment and start to kind of feed back into the system, we can use it to really clean up our information landscape. And then we can start to push some of that data out to a self-service channel. And that's really where they started to really see the returns. Because now customers could go to the web, log in, use Data Explorer to find the information they were looking for, and not call into the call center. So that call avoidance, right, offloading all of that, gave them extreme productivity benefits, which they then took and leveraged into revenue-generating activities. Right? So that's kind of how their business case sort of unfolded over the evolution of their use of Data Explorer. And in the same way as the previous customer, now they're in 30 different silos. They've got a center of excellence running the different projects for the different groups within this big financial firm. So very, very successful. And this is kind of where we push our new customers to go. Really, stick with it. Once you develop a center of competency, you're going to like what you get because you're going to start to get amplifying results. All right, so let me show you a quick demo. This is the interface of a fictional contact center agent, Eric Stamos. So I'm logged in as Eric Stamos, and this is the Data Explorer homepage for Eric. And the first thing you'll see is that Eric's being pushed a bunch of information that has been configured or the system realizes is relevant to him. So it's been configured that he can see his average call handling time in comparison with others in the call center. This fictional firm cares about that, right? That's part of their strategy in the call center. You can see his calendar coming from Exchange or Notes or what have you. He can see who he's been tracking, so you can track certain customers or products, things that you're continually interacting with. You can see some promotional offerings that are maybe being pushed from the marketing system, some FAQs or news that might be coming from the web. And in the middle, you can see there's some integration here with the company's IVR system, and you can see there's a customer calling in. Janet Robertson's currently authenticating through the system, presumably based on her caller ID, and Eric's not going to let her wait, so he clicks on her name. And now what happens? Well, the context just changed. So whereas in the previous page, in essence, Eric was the entity, and everything was being pushed around what Eric's interested in, Now you're looking at this customer, Janet Robertson, and the system's pushing all the information that it has around Janet Robertson, using the same kind of search relevancy that I've been talking about. And you can see the ability, you can track Janet for follow-up, which is, kind of gets her on your radar and her information starts appearing in your activity feed and on your homepage. You can see the company has some information somewhere about what kind of family members she has. Maybe she took an insurance survey a while back. Over on the right, you can see some purchased products. Oh, interesting. Some of those policies have lapsed. So that's interesting information potentially for the call. You can see some recommendations. So Eric's talking on the phone with Janet. Immediately, presumably, the conversation starts out pretty smooth because Eric's got context. He's looking at a lot of information, right? And he kind of knows her situation at a glance. He can see her contact information. And you can't see a whole lot of it here, but you can see her activity feed, which I know it's kind of at the bottom here and minimized, but that's really her timeline of interaction with this company. So Eric can kind of quickly see, who did she talk to last? What channels has she been going through? Has she been coming in over the web? Has she been calling in? Maybe there's a branch scenario and she's been going into the branch. All right, so it turns out the scenario is that Janet asks about her auto insurance. She happens to know it's lapsed. So Eric kind of clicks over one more time. The context changes, right? This is the auto insurance product page where Eric can kind of see some information. Janet mentions that she got some marketing collateral about multi-policy discounts. Eric can see this here. I think you get the idea, right? It's context is key when you're having a conversation with the customer. Now, let's say Janet asks some sort of outlandish question, right, that doesn't appear on this screen. Eric still has the search capabilities. If she asks about a claim, types in claim, and now you're kind of back to more of a traditional pull information approach, where you're getting information from the index around a claim, and you can refine it by any of these metadata: source, product type, product manager, for example, if it's a product. You can see some highlight, what we call spotlights, sponsored results around auto claim support. That's something an administrator really wants the users to see if they're searching on specific keywords. You can see some shared folders. The clusters are down there. Those are represented in this interface in a tag cloud, right, to kind of show the dominance of the different themes. And then you can see all the search results. And this gives Eric a fighting chance at getting her the information she needs without having to forward her to talk to somebody else within the organization. Make sense? So that's kind of it in a nutshell. How we gotten started with all of this, in most cases, it's gone by different names over the years. Nowadays, in IBM, we're using the client value engagement. And Vic's going to talk about that. We're partnering with Saturn to do some work around the client value engagements to get new customers started with Data Explorer. So let me take a couple questions first, and then you want to come up. Does anybody have any questions about the architecture, the demo, or anything that I covered?
Yes, Scott, is data all live, or how often is it refreshed?
In the index?
Yeah,
good question. Is the data all live? So if you go back to the architecture, I won't click back unless we need to. Those connectors, after the initial crawl, we call that a full crawl, that kind of fills the index. Those connectors are sitting and they're observing the repositories for changes. They're looking for additions of content. They're looking for changes to content. They're looking for deletions. They're looking for changes to security information. Potentially, a document, the security might change, which is important. And that's configurable. So depending on the client's infrastructure, we might configure that polling rate to be really tight and have a really fast refresh rate. Or we might configure it to be a little less aggressive because it puts, depending on the repository, it puts more or less of a load on the repository, right? But yeah, there's a notion of full refresh and then what we call partial refresh, which keeps that index up to date. All right.
The one thing that I wanted to ask you is we can bring in, like in this dashboard view, we can also bring in content from your BI as well as your predictive applications, right? So based on your view of the world, if you want to see what the prediction will be like, then you can integrate that into this dashboard.
Yes, yeah. I don't know.
I think that's a pretty powerful.
Yeah, and that's something I've noticed as a trend is, since we're part of the big data group, we're running into a lot more BI type customers, especially with Hadoop and streams. You know, those components are creating these nice analytics. And basically, what's analytics or insights? Where do you put those insights when they're created? Well, it turns out you can put them right here in the context of the information that was used to create them, right? And the nice kind of subtle benefit of that is the end users that are looking at those insights, which is basically derivative information that was produced by an analytics engine, they're looking at those analytics now in the context of the primary source information. So they tend to have a lot more confidence in it because they're seeing it, again, in context. They're not just seeing some BI report that somebody plucked off a file share, which is really out of its context. They're seeing it in context on a chart or a graph in the context of a lot of information that probably was used to create it in the first place. So that's one interesting dynamic we've seen. Yeah.
Scott, what about the APIs that come with this? Are there certain APIs out there?
Yep.
You can ask a lot about that.
Yeah. So I was talking about scalability. I was talking about what we've been focused on. Data Explorer's always had an API. So that's how the OEM customers that we've had have interacted with the platform. That's how, if you've already got your own desktop and you want to use Data Explorer behind the scenes, you can interact with it programmatically. I mentioned we're kind of like an OEM component within IBM now. So we've been talking about the connectors, for example. Most connectors are pull. They go out to a repository and pull information. But when you talk about crawling and indexing platforms like Hadoop, you can't really do that. It's too vast. It's too much data out there to think that you can go and just crawl it like a SharePoint. So how do we do that? We have Hadoop, through the MapReduce jobs, actually push data to the index of Data Explorer through our API. And there's been a lot of work over the last year to make that API extremely bulletproof, in the sense that if you are going to scale up your solution and you're going to add servers, you're going to try to horizontally scale, that API doesn't have to be administered, right? It's smart enough to kind of know that, additional hardware. So I'm going to rebalance the index and take advantage of this new hardware or this extra CPU or this extra memory, whatever it is, right? So that API is just constantly being worked on by engineering to really fit well into this big data world and make sure that it doesn't become I guess the long pole in the tent for implementation.